Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's webinar on the love of learning. My name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And we have a very exciting event today about bringing beauty to education. I'd like to introduce my co-host is Alexandra Hudson, an award-winning journalist, author, speaker, as well as the founder of Civic Renaissance, a newsletter and intellectual community dedicated to moral and cultural renewal. And this week we have a very special guest, Margarita Mooney Suarez. She is currently an associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, having served as faculty at institutions of higher education since 2005. She is also the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to restoring meaning and purpose to universities and schools by promoting liberal arts education. As a woman whose work lies at the intersection of social sciences with philosophy and theology, she excels at encouraging students, readers, listeners, and audiences to think about important questions in beauty, education, femininity, vocation, hope, and faith in new and different ways. And it is these topics of which we will be speaking about today. Just a few comments to say, please keep off your microphones in videos as we proceed. Lexi will start us off with the questions, and then I'll take over for the Q&A in about half an hour or 40 minutes. Please feel free to write in questions as you go and as you think about them in the chat. Lexi has also just moved, so her internet is a little bit unstable. So I ask your patience and understanding as we all understand the difficulties of technology. So if for any reason she jumps out or disappears, I will be a poor substitute for her, but I will make my best. So with that, I will turn us over to Lexi.
Anya, thank you. Apologize to everyone in advance if there is an issue with technology. We just bought a 100-year-old historic home, and these gorgeous brick walls aren't really conducive to our modern technological world. So thank you for your patience, and thank you all for being here for a little bit, spending a bit of your afternoon with us, talking about beauty, one of my favorite topics. My aesthetic informs everything about my life, and I'm so grateful to Margarita for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk with us about this important topic today, beauty and education. So I'm looking forward to the results of the poll. Should we do that now, Anya, or after? Looking at the first.
I'll let people answer it for a little while as we go, and then maybe later on when we do Q&A, so people have time to answer it.
Excellent, sounds good. So before we dive into our dialogue about beauty and education, let's define our terms, and I'll turn it over to Margarita to help us think, what's a working definition of beauty, and a related topic or theme, phrase that I know you like to use a lot, Margarita, poetic knowledge. So that's the expression of beauty and education. So give us some working definitions of beauty and poetic knowledge.
Well, thank you for having me here. Hello, everybody. It's an honor to be here with Lexi and Anya, and I'm delighted to have this conversation. In regards to defining the term beauty, I would use a definition of beauty that came to me from Jacques Maritain, who was drawing on Thomas Aquinas. We can get a little deeper into that later, but I want to emphasize that beauty is an experience. It's a perception through some natural or artistic lens of the underlying order of the universe. So in his book, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, the French philosopher and phenomenologist really attuned to human experience, Jacques Maritain, wrote that beauty is the splendor of the secrets of being radiating into intelligence. Now, I hope we get time to unpack those terms, right? Because it sounds like a lot of words, the splendor of being radiating into intelligence. I think that to understand beauty, we have to understand some of the debates around what beauty is and isn't. But I'll just continue for a moment in the lens of Maritain, because what Maritain is trying to do with beauty is take it out of the realm of the purely mystical or mysterious. And he's trying to bring beauty back from the postmoderns, I think, and also from the romantics, to not just being a feeling or an intuition, but having a form that expresses itself in a work. So for Maritain, beauty is part of poetic knowledge, which is not mystical knowledge. Knowledge just stays inside of me or between me and God, as great as that is. It's not scientific knowledge, and it's not analytical knowledge. It's where the objective and the subjective come to being, right? So it's where the being that our intuition senses expresses itself in a form that we experience in nature or in art.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us those working definitions, and also for introducing Jacques Maritain. His work and his oeuvre is incredibly objectively important, but also especially influential to me. I just spent this weekend 3 days poring over his works, Personhood and the Common Good, Truth, Humanism, and what else? It's on my desk right here: scholasticism and politics, and education at the crossroads. May I ask? You may not know off the top of your head, but where is that definition of beauty from, and which of his? If not, we can send out resources later after these, so if you don't have it, but just to direct audiences to his works on beauty. If you have that citation off the top of your head, that would be really helpful.
The definition of beauty that I cited is from Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry. I recommend that viewers get the re-released edition by Clooney Media, in which I have a little bit of an introduction, I think, in that one. That's actually, and so I want to emphasize, you just listed off some of his works. He was an incredibly astute philosopher, but Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry was the last book he wrote. So as a scholar, right, if you want to look at someone's career over 60 years, look at Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, because he's mostly known, as you just mentioned, for his political philosophy, which is incredibly important. The person in the common good. He lived through, World War II. He was exiled from France to the United States. He was sent by Rome to work at the Vatican on post-World War II politics. He cared deeply about the Christian democratic parties in Europe and the United States. But his first love was poetry and art. Before he became an analytical philosopher, a Thomist, his wife was a poet. He was friends with French poets who were dealing with the major issues around the crises of World War I and World War II. And so when I read Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, I saw all of Maritain's interests that you mentioned. What is a human person? What is the common good? What is creativity? What is our ultimate end as a person? All coming together through his passion for helping the modern world recover this understanding of art and poetry as intrinsic to the kind of combining of our being and expressing itself in a doing, in practical action, which he very much cared about, practical action.
That's really interesting. The theme of human dignity and personhood, and this idea, this question, what does it mean to be a human being? That is central to and kind of a through line through all of his many works, as you just mentioned. And I love that tidbit you shared, that his work on his reflection on poetry, on art, on beauty is like the culmination of a lifetime of deep thinking about the richness, complexity of and dignity of the human person. That it's an important part of what it means to be human, to not just live, but live beautifully, right? We like birds and wild animals, they make homes. We make beautiful homes, right? Like it's a part of us to ornament and adorn what we love and value, which, I hope we have time to talk about the tradition of sacred art. We, across religious denomination, like some of the beautiful works of architecture and art in the world are religiously inspired, because we adorn, we make beautiful that which we value as a society, and religions across time and place have done that with their religious ideas, their themes, their deities as well. And I think I'm grateful you brought up Maritain as well, because this theme of personhood. He was as you mentioned, his wife was Jewish, and they were forced to flee Europe during the rise of Nazism and anti-Semitism, and he was integral to the rebuilding of the post-war world, which culminated, I think, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that he was a co-drafter of. The world had just saw unconscionable suffering and dehumanization in the form of genocide and racism and imperialism and conquest to a scale that we had not known before in human history. And he had done all this deep thinking and reflecting on this idea of personhood and human dignity. And finally, it seemed like the world was ready to hear kind of his ideas. And so it's wonderful that he was able to have such a platform to talk about these ideas. And so human dignity is central to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, saying it's not just our own people that matter. It's the fundamental person that matters. And that's why he is so interested in this project of education, and particularly a humanistic and a liberal arts education, of which the aesthetic is so core. And so I'm curious, what do you think is the ideal way, Margarita, to integrate beauty into our educational system today? And I'll look forward to seeing the poll results, what people think about whether we have education in our era now, and whether we need more of it. But if you could wave your wand and make some changes to the way education is done in our mainstream institutions, Margarita, what would you do?
Well, in my book that I published last year with Clooney Media, The Love of Learning, 7 Dialogues in the Liberal Arts, I spend a fair amount of time discussing with other scholars Jacques Maritain's book that you mentioned, Education at the Crossroads. And I've been inspired by some of Maritain's suggestions, which I think can be updated to our present day. But first of all, let me make one of Maritain's key points is that, and he's speaking in the middle of the 1940s to Americans at Yale University. They were published lectures, but he said, basically he says, I love Americans. They're very pragmatic. They're really practical. He said, but we have to remember that the primary end of education is not a method or a strategy. The primary end of education is the development of a free human person. So freedom is the means and ends of education. And he said, educational theories go wrong when they forget the foundational principles of what is a human person. So as you already said, Lexi, Maritain believes strongly that human beings are an integrated mind, body, and soul. And for him, the seat of that human dignity that you talked about, the seat of that individuality that confers not just a biological uniqueness, I'm different from you biologically, but my dignity is in that soul, which has the capacity for transcendence and communication with God. And because of that capacity to communicate with God, also has a capacity for self-gift, right? So Maritain believed that education is to form that inner dynamism of the person, to train them, not just in skills, but also in the virtues and in their full development, what he would call and so I would call it, also building on one of Maritain's terms, an integral humanist development. Because for Maritain, what does he mean by integral? You mentioned that he and his wife were responding to horrors of the Russian Revolution and Nazism, but they were also responding to a kind of atheist humanism that denies the spiritual reality of the human person. And in fact, one might very well argue that political philosophies like Nazism and communism grew out of this atheism that denies human dignity and sees everything about history as nothing but the expression of power, because there's nothing that transcends the political. So for Maritain, right? So what does that mean today for education? Again, this sounds like a lot of words, but Maritain was warning that the United States had been very heavily influenced by pragmatist philosophers such as John Dewey, who had a lot of really important things to say, but neglected the spiritual side of the human person and left the spiritual as somehow, yeah, it's there, but it's not something to be educated. It's something to just let reign free. Well, most religions and philosophies don't think that our spiritual nature is somehow itself not in need of education or encountering a tradition or being disciplined or being formed to be in conformity with an external reality. Most world philosophies and religions claim that there is an objective reality to which we are beholden, to which we are responsible. And I think that, frankly, that sense of responsibility is just not present in a lot of young people for whom education is about fulfilling their self-desire, but their desire has no direction. It has no sense of purpose, no sense of order. So why doesn't that just lead to internal chaos, anxiety, depression, mental illness? Well, I mean, maybe it does. Maybe it does. And this is why I started writing about this, Lexi. I'm not trained as a philosopher of education. My degrees are in psychology and sociology. My work has been about Haiti. It's been about Mexico. It's been about young people who suffer with mental illness. It's been about addiction. And I've worked closely mentoring students at the University of North Carolina, at Yale University, at Princeton University, now at Princeton Theological Seminary. I haven't talked to anybody who works in student life in any of those schools who does not think the single biggest problem that highly educated elite students face is meaninglessness.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Margarita. So Jacques Maritain was a theist. He was a Christian, a devout Catholic. And we thought about this a lot as we talked about his works this past weekend, but to what extent do you think we need to accept his theological underpinnings, that God exists, and that particularly, the tenets of the Catholic Christian faith, in order to appreciate his theory of education, his theory of the human person, the concept of human dignity that is the philosophical underpinning of modern human rights that we all take for granted today? Or, as it relates to our conversation today, a vision of beauty being a part of humanizing us, making us full human beings.
Well, Lexi, when I talk about these issues with people, I work with people of all different kinds of backgrounds, faith, no faith. I think Maritain was speaking to anybody, regardless of where they were coming from. But it is difficult to have a meaningful conversation about first principles with people who think they don't have first principles. So it's difficult when people say, oh, well, because you have an understanding of who God is, I'm coming at it from a neutral position because I have no beginning point. My beginning point is purely human sensory experience. I'm like, well, but that itself is a philosophical stance, that there is no truth other than human sensory experience. It could be correct, but it doesn't make it neutral. Does that make sense? So I think what's happened in the modern world is precisely that philosophy, the discipline of philosophy, very often says that metaphysics, the study of being, is outside of the bounds of reason. And the only thing we can reason about is sensory perception and material reality. Well, but what? So then we can't say anything true about love. We can't say anything true about beauty. We can't say anything really true about values at all. And I think when people make that claim, most often they live a different way. They live as if they love their spouse, and that's really true, you know? So again, I think values and the soul, I mean, I think that these are important questions. I think we can talk about them, we can discuss them openly, and I think we can disagree. But ultimately, I don't think the fact that you and I disagree or could disagree, or that I disagree with somebody else, means that I create the true answer. My understanding of education is we're in a discovery process. And I'm going to be partially wrong on some things, but there is an objective truth that does not depend on my correctness in knowing it.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to remind everyone who is here enjoying this dialogue, please get your questions ready. We will turn to questions in about 5-10 minutes, and we look forward to hearing from you. We want to invite you into this important dialogue. So Margarita, in the classical tradition, there is this understanding that of the unity of beauty, goodness, and truth, which is kind of maybe analogous to the unity of the human person being mind, body, spirit. And as you mentioned, that was an important, this concept of integral humanism being important to Maritain as well. And I'm curious what you think. What about instances? What about people who say, beauty is just, a pretty face, it's purely aesthetics. And by the way, what about when appearances deceive? What about when beauty, a pretty face, a pretty, polish is actually, a ruse, a guise. It's used for deceit. It's used for untruth. It's used to commit evil in the world. So what about these instances? What about people that say or might argue that beauty is just appearance, it's just superficial aesthetics, and actually can be a tool of bad, of ill will as well?
So I think it's really important how you started the question, the sort of classical understanding of the unity of truth and beauty and goodness. And also how you started your conversation with me with defining some terms, because I think we can't answer the question you just asked without defining our terms and without looking at debates about beauty across history. So I have a forthcoming book called The Wounds of Beauty, 7 Dialogues on Beauty and Education. It'll be released this June 2022 with Clooney Media. And the first chapter is a dialogue between me and my friend and neighbor, Peter Brown, an historian of the classical world and late antiquity. He's most known for his biography of St. Augustine. But he makes this point in our dialogue that, as you said, in the ancient Greek world, kind of beauty was above all a human achievement. It was a human creation, as I've said. So again, I'm pointing beauty back, in my definition, to something in the material world, right? It has a form. And so beauty is also, I think in the classical world, the material forms are understood as having a symbolic dimension, having that they carry within them a sign, right? That we can perceive through our senses an order of perfect unity and harmony and clarity, right? This is what Plato would have, those are actually Aquinas's words. So I think then if we're talking about beauty as I've defined it, right, as revealing the harmony of the material world, but pointing to a reality that exists in perfection beyond this material world, then observations such as, oh, there are things I'm attracted to that aren't good for me, well, they don't meet that definition of beauty, right? I might be very attracted to heroin, as people I've interviewed with, right? They find a lot of pleasure in that. But I'm not defining beauty as anything we're attracted to or anything that pleases us, because things we're attracted to and things that please us in one moment might actually be bad for us. So that doesn't meet my definition of beauty. What I think has happened in the modern world is that people have said beauty equals anything I think is good and ugly is anything I think is bad. The problem is human persons are attracted to things that are bad for them. And being attracted to something that's bad for me doesn't mean it's beautiful because I'm attracted to it. It means that my passions are disordered.
So
I think we lost you a little bit there, Lexi. Margarita, could you hear Lexi then?
No, unfortunately, I couldn't.
Lexi, I think we've lost you a little bit, to be honest. I think, but maybe
it's time to turn to questions anyway.
Okay. Well, I was gonna ask a follow-up question
Sure.
then from that last point, because to go back to the original definition, that if beauty is sort of an expression of an underlying unity, how can we ever know beauty then if it isn't what we're immediately attracted to, if it isn't what we find pleasure in? How can we know that something is truly beautiful?
So I also want to be careful, Anya, not to seem as if I'm saying that there's nothing pleasing or attractive about beauty. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that beauty isn't simply that, right? I also want to say that with regards to, and this comes up in my dialogue with Dana Gioia that's in my book, there's a long history of thinking about suffering as beautiful. Well, what does that mean? Now, again, Dana Gioia, as a poet, as a writer, as a champion of the humanities, former chair of the National Endowment of the Arts, right? He wants to argue, and I frankly really agree with him, that suffering is beautiful, can be, it isn't automatically, can be beautiful when it reveals to us more deeply something true about the world. So again, your question, Anya, well, how do we know, what truth? Well, you have to have a definition of how we get to truth and where does truth come from? Because otherwise, beauty as an experience needs some kind of a, dare I say, tradition or authority or something transcendent outside of itself that it's pointing to, right? So suffering, look, we're all mortals. Dana Gioia talked in his chapter in my book about accompanying his son as his son died at a young age. It was extremely painful and it caused him, yes, a lot of suffering, but he can reflect on it and call it beautiful because it helped him understand deeper the mysteries of human love and divine love. I would say, talking with my friends who do theater or literature, people who portray darkness and ugliness and destruction without pointing to a deeper meaning from it, I would say, no, that's not beautiful. What that is chaos and it's destruction, and it's destruction for the sake of destruction. And that's very different than portraying suffering as a way of revealing to us a deeper truth, which I think Dostoevsky also did, for example.
I was just thinking that what you're saying there, that on the one end, you could just have something that's being grotesque for grotesque's sake without revealing something. And that, even, so I studied art history, so I immediately try to think of like artistic examples and I like to think of like beauty built from resilience or imperfections. And one of my first thoughts was kintsugi, the Japanese pottery technique. When you break a bowl, then they re-glue it together, but they use gold to even highlight the imperfections. And it made me think of, say, like a Hellenistic sculpture with the boxer, and you see all of his imperfections, and there's something truly beautiful about seeing not just the suffering, but the overcoming of suffering, the building back together, the resilience that can happen as a result of going through something like a bowl being cracked.
Right.
Now, I've got quite a few questions, so I might start some of these. The first one is, there is a noetic quality in whatever form the exalted experience is perceived, a form of beauty, if you will. So it could be symbolic both in the material and sensory dimension, but also in the Jungian construct of the symbolic life. Your thoughts on the above would be appreciated.
Well, I think it's really important to think about the symbolic world as having a material form. There's more than one way to think about symbols or symbolism. And the way that I'm talking about it, that our symbolic thinking and our understanding of material form go together. I think this is where Lexi mentioned earlier, the tradition of sacred art. That would be one place to see it, but I think it's not the only. But the idea that, for example, that there's actually certain mathematical qualities to art isn't what people normally think of, right? People might think of that with music, right? Are there mathematical qualities to classical music? Yes, there are. Are there mathematical qualities to sacred art? Yes, there are. Are there mathematical qualities to the architecture at Princeton University? Yes, there are. And those mathematical qualities, which we don't perceive, but they're principles that bring out the form and show the beauty of the form. So when people ask me, well, isn't beauty just isn't it just subjective? It's what one person likes or another. Well, there's a lot of diversity in tastes, but there are certain principles that I believe we are made to perceive. When you walk around Princeton University, we have a couple of buildings of modern architecture, the kind of blocks, cement blocks where all the windows are the same size. You don't see tourists taking pictures of those. You do see them taking pictures of neo-Gothic buildings. And interestingly, this has now become like a photo shoot place where people come for their weddings and first communions and family photos. And it's striking to me that professional photographers pick 2 or 3 spots on Princeton's campus where the shape of the arches frames the human face, just like the shape of an icon frames the face on it. And that's where they take their pictures. Why? Because the frame highlights the human dimension that they're trying to photograph, right? So again, I think there's an objective form to beauty, and there's a subjective, because beauty is an experience. And by experience, I mean the joining of the material and the immaterial.
And I think just to add to that, like a lot of those ratios, it's like the golden ratio. I mean, we have mathematically calculated many of these architectural dimensions, as well as in paintings, so that you can see exactly the Fibonacci series, things like that, that help us to actually mathematically equate what is beautiful. So that works. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me? I just wanted to see if I have a good connection. For a second, I wanted to interject and say really quickly, in honor of having Margarita here with us, we'd like to invite people to enter into a giveaway of a year of Wondrium, or the teaching company. And I've just in the chat listed a number of their great course offerings that in case people wanted to dig into the history of art, the history of beauty. There's one even called the Joy of Thinking, the Beauty and Power of Classical Mathematical Ideas. So you could just have a good time unpacking some of their amazing offerings on the history of art, history of beauty, and in the spirit of democratizing access to the joy of learning and education and beauty, I would love to invite Margarita to share a little bit about Scala, which we haven't talked about yet. So just the mission and purpose. And I know you guys have a big event coming up in just a few days that I'm sure you're running around crazy getting ready for. So, and I know we have a hard stop at 1. So I wanted to make sure we had a chance to invite you to talk about Scala to perhaps direct people who might enjoy your offerings.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, I began to study these questions about education because I was passionate about helping students to find their purpose and discern their vocation in the world. So 5 years ago, I guess 6 years ago now, I started Scala Foundation because I wanted to help other educators and students understand the importance of a liberal arts tradition, not just for the elites, but for everybody. Because the liberal arts education is founded on the principles of the human person we've been talking about here, that we're mind, body, and soul, that there's a tradition of knowledge that helps shape our minds to perceive reality and to develop practical wisdom. Now, we host conferences. We have one coming up this weekend on art, the sacred, and the common good, because after doing my summer program on liberal arts education for several years and publishing The Love of Learning, the topic I find people most want to get together and discuss is precisely these questions about beauty. So this coming weekend in Princeton, we're going to be live streaming this event with four panels with 4 speakers each. And we're bringing together educators with culture creators, right? People who make beautiful things, right? There's a lot of people who write about aesthetic theories, but I'm trying to bring people who write film, literature, and make art and music together with people thinking about educational reform, classical education, and thinking about how do these theories of beauty intersect with our understanding of the common good. Scala's resources are also, there's a lot of videos like this with discussions like this on YouTube, but definitely check out the Love of Learning book I published last year and subscribe to Scala's newsletter to get our events and also to hear when my book, The Wounds of Beauty, comes out in June. I have found, I will just say, like, this has been so enlivening for me as an educator to delve into this topic of beauty. And let me just tell an anecdote about why I think this matters so much. When I was in my last semester at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I taught a class on virtues and happiness, and I took a character strengths test. Many of you have probably taken that in work or study. It tells you a little bit about your temperament, what your tendencies are. Well, every single one of these tests always tells me a similar version of the same thing, that I'm highly analytical, rational, structured, and organized. But what really upset me was that this particular character strengths test ranked me lowest in appreciation of beauty. And I thought, what happened? Like, I sang in the choir, you know, my family's really musical. I love the outdoors. I love art. And what I realized was that my own experiences in education had taken my strengths in analytical thinking and just pushed them to an extreme. And what I had not gotten was a holistic education. And what I feared was that I was passing on this narrow, purely analytical kind of education, which is important, but analytical forms of thinking are abstractions, right? And we are embodied human people. We need more than abstractions. And education is about more than ideas. Education is about encountering a teacher who knows her subject and loves it. It's about forming bonds with other people. And it's about reigniting that desire in us for the infinite. And what I found was that a lot of schools were trying to figure out how to make, as I've talked about it, experiential education, not just be entertainment, but the kinds of experiences that integrate and teach us about truth. So that's how Scala got started. And I would love to have you sign up for our conference this weekend or look for the videos from it that will be out on YouTube, and look for our books and our forthcoming events.
Well, we can put links to all of that in the follow-up email and with the video. So thank you for telling everyone a bit more about it. And I think you're completely right, though. If you think about Aristotle saying that we are the formation of our habits, if we make a habit of always thinking analytically and doing those kind of fields, then those are what we're going to excel in. So we need to make beauty and wisdom a habit as well. And I'd love to turn to one of the next questions, just because we have a few more and we don't have much time left. So I'll just jump in. The next one is from, aside from or in addition to capital B and lowercase b, beauty itself, any thoughts on the artistic process itself as transformative process of education? Dewey had lots to say about transforming education by demonstrating and putting into practice the fact that the processes evolved in the former, artistic creation and or appreciation, are akin to what occurs in learning itself.
So I think that what I understand from that question, or what I hear, is that it's really important to bring creativity into education. What I understand Dewey in part to have been reacting to was his sense that classical education, or education at the time, was about sitting still and memorizing. And I think Dewey was a kind of thinker who wanted to help students to each be creative, right? So he wanted the classroom to be like an experiment where you get to tinker. But again, this is too much to get into in this webinar, but I would definitely check out my book, The Love of Learning, because I think for Dewey, it remains unclear what his ultimate stance about metaphysical questions are. For me, it's not clear that Dewey has a sense of our spirituality or our creativity having a transcendent dimension. So for Dewey, creativity then is just anything. It's kind of indistinguishable from the passions. So I think kind of a downstream effect of this, maybe it's not what Dewey intended, but a downstream effect of this is that creativity isn't expression for the sake of expression, or frankly, I know maybe I'm stepping on some toes here, but art for art's sake wouldn't fit my definition of beauty, because my definition of beauty is creating a form that we then reflect upon and try to improve. And it has to have some purpose. And that purpose is usefulness as well as appearance. So art for art's sake, or creativity for creativity's sake, I don't think that's what we're after. And I don't think that that's artistic education. And I don't think that that's the kind of creativity that I'm hoping to unleash. What I'm hoping to get people to think about is being in a sense of awe, wonder, and really a kind of creativity that is a co-creation, a participation in an ordered reality. Because I think without that notion, and I think this is what human beings experience. I think human experience is that we're part of a bigger order than what we perceive with our five senses, right? And I think that our experiences are most fulfilling when we perceive that we're participating in something that has an eternal significance beyond this moment. And I just don't see that eternal significance in Dewey's philosophy.
And for people who don't believe in an ordered world, is there possibility for them to find beauty? And to another extent, for people who are suffering meaningless, how can we help people find meaning in a very multicultural world where people are going to have very different backgrounds and beliefs?
Well, if people don't believe in an ordered world, I would ask them, what do they believe in? And I would ask them, what have they experienced? When I interviewed people in one of my studies, they weren't trained academics or philosophers. Some of them hadn't gone past high school. Some of them hadn't finished high school. What I found really interesting is that, again, most people, and I've also spent, as I mentioned, I've spent time in Haiti, I've spent time in Mexico. These are not people who sit around reading aesthetic theories the way I do, right? But most people want to believe that their life has a purpose and has a meaning. And it's usually they can pinpoint some experience that seemed to communicate that to them. Maybe it was a beautiful sunset and they couldn't help be mesmerized by the idea that there's a big, wide reality. Maybe it was the expression of love from a child that just seemed so overwhelming, right? But humans have these experiences of an abundant goodness that seems to be pointing at something that is bigger than us. And I think that's kind of I would use the term natural theology for that. Now, the question about what is the origin of that experience, right, is where, systematic theology or philosophy comes in and tries to explain that. But I think it is a fundamental aspect of human experience to feel a part of something big and eternal, and to want to believe that the people that we love participate beyond this life in a realm of being to which we're also directed.
So to bring about something that's bigger than ourselves and to make it very modern, could you say distinctly modern phenomena like technology or social media can embody a beauty in their own way, or are they by definition cut off from beauty?
I try not to say that particular things in technology are intrinsically evil or bad. I mean, social media is a big term in and of itself. I think that what we're doing here today is using social media with a higher purpose of trying to investigate these questions and form a little micro community. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. I think, this is also, I think, one of Lexi's earlier questions, I believe, about evil, right? And I think that I always understand evil as a privation of the good. And again, I'm drawing here really on Aquinas, but I think that evil is a turning away from the good. And I think even most characters that are villains in movies, like think of Darth Vader, right? He has chosen the dark side, right? And a lot of the movie is about trying to turn him back. So his evil is only understood as a rejection of the good. So so I think the problems with technology aren't because we have computers that can connect tons of people to look at images. I think that our human weaknesses lead us to misuse that technology. And we need to be realistic about what our human weaknesses are. And then we need to develop the virtues that will allow us to use technology, to use technology in an appropriate human manner. But I don't think saying no to technology will mean that suddenly we don't have human weaknesses. I don't see how that could be. But certainly, there's no question that the speed of technological change, that the amount of social media is creating a sense of distractedness and difficulty in concentration. All of those problems are real. But again, I would just emphasize that the problem starts with human weakness. It doesn't start with the tool.
I think that's very well said. Oh, I think you're muted. You come, there you go.
Thank you. Am I okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yeah, we lost you for a little bit, but glad you came back.
Okay, great. I wanted to add just some resources to that echo and fortify all of what Margarita was sharing that have been really monograph by a Harvard English professor, I think. Her name is Elaine Scarry. It's called On Beauty and Being Just. And she tries to reclaim this classical tradition goodness, truth, and justice instead of all these virtues and ideas. And one of the arguments she makes is that, Margarita said a moment ago that a lot of this stems, a lot of the human suffering and stems from human weakness. I would take it one step further. It stems from human ego and selfishness that's endemic to the human soul. Augustine called it, the inward curve upon the self, that we are both biologically and morally driven to meet our own needs and think of ourselves before others. And what Elaine Scarry says in her book is that beauty, these experiences that they help us get our eyes off of ourselves. They displace the ego, diminishing it so we can be more other oriented and see just the vastness and greatness of the world. And then a second resource that echoes this point is from Edmund Burke. He's known as a conservative political theorist and is kind of in the canon of conservative theory, but he has this wonderful essay called On the Sublime, where it's an inquiry into the sublime. And he says that the sublime is exactly this experience of awe and transcendence. Beautiful, like just encountering a sunrise or staring at the mountain.
Sorry, we're losing you again. It's kind of breaking in and out. But can I just say that we will be in the follow-up email putting those references that you had, just so that everyone can catch them, because you're going in and out a little bit at the end there. But if I could, just to return to just one or two more last audience questions, because we only got about 10 minutes left. One was from Arjun, who asked, can there be beauty without an experiencer?
Can there be beauty without an experiencer? I, again, will just point to what I have been saying all along, that my understanding of beauty is where the material and the immaterial come together. So I do want to say that there's a subjective experiential dimension to beauty, and there's an objective. So, and I do understand that definition of beauty goes against either the idea that there's an ideal form that's beyond our perception, or that there's a kind of internal experience. I'm not calling beauty an internal experience, and I'm not calling it a form that's beyond our perception. Neither of those would fit my understanding of beauty. And I think I think the kind of definition I'm putting out there is different than how others might discuss beauty. And I think what I'm saying is it draws on Plato, but it also draws really on kind of the integration of Platonic insights with a Christian understanding of the capacity and the reality of the divine revealing itself in the world. It's not only Christianity that believes that, but what I'm trying to say is that my understanding of beauty is that beauty has a material dimension and a symbolic dimension, but that meaning that we're perceiving is always unfinished. It's a sign of a deeper reality.
And so just to finish us off a little bit, because there so many times we've asked for very practical ways that we can bring back beauty and wisdom. And I've relaunched the poll just to see if we can get some answers. And it seems that most people agree that only in some places there are beauty and education today. And that between it's most definitely essential that we need it, as well as it would be nice where possible. But the question of how can we best add beauty to education? And I've put down a few options with regards to, say, art, history and art, philosophy, literature, music, or it's not a subject, but a way of teaching. So I've been asking the audience this. I'd like to ask you, Margarita, what you think. Is there certain subjects you think that can really help students find that meaning, that beauty, that wisdom, that awe, or is it a way of thinking? How would you advise, no doubt, educators in our audience?
Well, listen, as I think you and Lexi know so well, the idea of a liberal arts education, a classical liberal arts education, it's It's about the integration of different fields of knowledge, right? So look, it's a great thing to be teaching art and art history, but we shouldn't be doing that apart from science, right? The liberal arts curriculum should be understood as a whole. Now, that said, it has particular parts, but I think it would be wrong to deprive students of an education in math and science just because we want to teach them art, as if science and math doesn't have something to say to art, right? So there's the holistic sense of the curriculum. What I hear often from parents and educators is, well, that sounds nice, but that's just not realistic in my school or my context or whatever. So there I say, look, that really might be true, and it might be the case. So whatever realm of influence you have, your children, your classroom, if you educate yourself, such as by coming to these webinars, reading books, looking for resources online, you'll teach better whatever subject you're teaching if you understand your subject in relation to a whole. We're doing a lot to produce specialists. We're not producing generalists, or we're not producing people who can teach a subject in relation to others. So take advantage of these wonderful resources out there. The love of learning means that learning is a lifelong process of education. And so I would just say that one educator or one parent or one student living this model of education anywhere is going to have a big effect. So I would say that, and then I would say, yes, absolutely. I think we need to value the humanities and art history and music also, provided they live up to what they're supposed to be and don't become captive to political ideology, which sadly I think is happening. And I think it may be why sometimes people don't want to invest in it. So now I know I already said, I don't say art for art's sake, but I am saying that the beauty of art and the beauty of music, as James Matthew Wilson says in a chapter in my book, The Beauty of Poetry, speaks for itself. And people making beautiful literature, beautiful art, and beautiful music do not need to be told to give that beauty a political message. The beauty is the message. So we need artists who can create beautiful works of fiction, art, and music, and let the audiences ponder what they're saying, not tell them how to think. So those are some things those are some things. I would also say there's other things you can do, such as to bring beauty back in your life. Roger Scruton talks about this. The most accessible form of beauty we have is nature. And most nature is not wild nature. Most of our experiences of nature are curated parks, paths, meadows that have been cleared. So it's not like nature by itself that hasn't been touched by humans. Very few of us experience that, and we'd mostly die if we did. But how about practicing silence in nature, just going on a walk? What are we doing then? We're practicing attentiveness. We're practicing listening. We're practicing being present to all of reality in the moment. That's something anyone can do, and it doesn't cost money. I also think beauty shouldn't discount imitation. We should be memorizing poems, reading them out loud, and in art classes, let's copy masters. Not because for the rest of your life, that's what you're gonna do, but artistic forms that we're gonna create anew need to understand the forms that came before them. And you do that by imitation. And frankly, kids oftentimes like memorizing and imitating. Doesn't mean we don't have spontaneous activity, but let's bring back some reading poems out loud and copying great works of art.
I completely agree, and I thought that was beautifully said. It's very funny to see how in different cultures that's still something that people do. And I mean, I don't know if anyone here spent a lot of time in Russia, but you could talk to any taxi driver and they will quote Pushkin. And it is different depending on the culture you're in. And I think being able to hold that kind of poetry in your heart from memorizing as a child, when you have those neurons to be able to memorize, you have that for the rest of your life. So it's certainly worthwhile. With that, I think we are coming to the end of our time. I want to say quickly a thank you to Sean Kelly, our managing editor and behind the scenes tech. I want to say a great big thank you to Margarita as well. Thank you for taking your time and for telling us about Scala Foundation, art, beauty and education. Thank you for our wonderful audience for taking the time. And I'll turn you over to Lexi for a final goodbye. Oh, Lexi, you're muted though.
Thank you to each of you for being here today and bringing a little bit more beauty to your lives by having this conversation about beauty and its relevance and its timeless importance to our modern world and to living a full, rich life. And thank you to Margarita for facilitating this conversation and guiding us as you thought so deeply about this topic. We all really benefited from your insight. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. And I wish everyone here a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you both, Lexi and Anya. Thank you everyone for coming. I look forward to being in touch.
Bye.